Hello and welcome to the Work and Wellbeing Podcast with me, your host, Eileen Donnelly. I've been chatting to Matt Wilson, who is the UK Wellbeing Lead at Computacenter. We had an incredible conversation about Matt's personal journey of finding his voice and therefore finding his way into a career in wellbeing. And there were some really interesting moments where we were talking about inclusivity and what that really meant for his ability to thrive in his career. So I started by asking Matt to tell me a little bit about himself.
Yeah, thank you, Eileen. Really great to be here. And thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm Matt Wilson. So I'm first and foremost father to two children, two lovely children who greeted me this morning because it's actually my birthday. Today greeted me with a balloon and some gifts and a cup of tea in bed, which was lovely. And also husband to Sam. So we've been married for a couple of years now. And that's absolutely the way that I would always introduce myself. That is first and foremost my priority. As you say, I'm the UK Wellbeing Lead at Computacenter, and I've been here since January in this year, so coming up to 6 months. Workplace wellbeing is something that has become a real interest and passion of mine over the past few years, really. Started back in 2018 in my role at the time, which I'll go into in more detail, but I think it's important to give a bit more context around me as an individual before I start talking about what I've done in the workplace. When I was really young, had an incredibly fortunate and privileged childhood. Huge gratitude to my parents for giving me the opportunities that I had. When I was at school, I must have been about 7 or 8 years old, I realized that I had a stammer, or a stutter, as some people call it. And that really has had a huge impact on my life. Even up until the current day, this is my first appearance on a podcast, and it's not something that I've ever really felt comfortable about speaking and using my voice to express myself. My stammer impacted me all the way through my childhood and into my adult life, my working career. I soon became aware at school that I hated reading out loud. I hated reading from a script and having to say certain words because I really struggled, especially as a child. My stammer was quite pronounced, and it really had an impact on me, my self-esteem as a child, although I didn't realize it at the time. And the way that my family approached that, we had a very loving environment. And as I say, I was very fortunate to be brought up in that environment. But we also had a knack of kind of mocking each other a little bit, and taking the mickey out of each other, and being mocked for not being able to say my own name, for instance. I used to really struggled with M's and W's, which is a real problem when you're called Matt Wilson. Yeah, it's one of those things that kind of stuck with me from that early age. And as I went through my childhood, went to a grammar school, and I found that tough academically. I was always quite near the top of the class in my primary and middle school. And as I went through into the grammar school environment, I really struggled to keep up and to cope with the impact that my stammer was having on me. And I wasn't really aware at the time of how much it did have an impact on me, but I managed to find different coping mechanisms, predominantly avoiding situations as best I could, but to have to read or speak in front of people or do a talk or a presentation in front of the class. And I became incredibly good at that. All sorts of different ways to avoid those situations. But what I realized later in life was that had created something within me that I was going to carry with me, as I say, until the present day. And when I joined the workplace, I wasn't necessarily doing something that I was hugely interested in. I had to earn a living. Before I joined the workplace, I went to university. I lasted 6 weeks at university. I decided that at the first moment where our tutor shared with us that we were going to have to do a presentation on a certain project, I was like, no, I'm out of here. I'm not going to put myself through this anymore. And at that point, I realized that I had a choice in that, and I could avoid that. I could make that decision myself. I had the autonomy to make that decision. And that really gave me what I felt was a huge sense of relief to leave that environment, to come home, to find work in a place where I felt comfortable, where I wasn't going to have to talk in front of people necessarily. And as I say, at the time, I wasn't so aware of this, but this was hugely impactful on the way that my career developed in the coming years. And I moved into a variety of different roles. Strangely, my first role was in a bank as a cashier. So I was actually talking to people all the time. And there were times when we had to say things. We had to try and drive sales and generate leads for our advisors in the branch. And that was tricky, but I managed to cope with that. But I found myself going through life in roles where I felt as though I was able to just blend in. And I'd become, as I say, very good at that, my education. And I think those roles left me feeling comfortable. They left me feeling content. Those are two words that I would use that I don't necessarily feel right now. I'm not comfortable and I'm not content in the work that I do now. And I'll explain more about that as we go through. But as I progressed through my career, there were times where people said, you have things to offer. What do you want to do? How do you want to progress? And I was petrified of progression because I associated progression with responsibility, with being able to stand up in front of people and share my thoughts using my voice. And there was no real other way to do that at the time. And that really stunted my development. It really just left me in a place where I was happy to just continue doing what I was doing. I told myself that I'd become good at my job and I really liked doing a good job and being fully aware of what I needed to do. But actually, that was creating something within me that just left me feeling unfulfilled and ultimately leads to poor well-being if I'm looking at it through the well-being lens that I see now. And as I progressed through different companies, I say progressed, as I moved through different companies and stayed at a relatively low level, I'd started to realize that people were important to me. And for me, the sense of satisfaction that I got from my work was around people, helping people to do their jobs, primarily in the early phases of my career doing supply chain work and working in e-commerce. And it was while I was working in e-commerce at Amazon that I really started to understand a bit more about people and what I liked to see, what I didn't like to see, but also how I thought that I could make a difference to people. And working at Amazon was a real experience, very competitive environment. People not necessarily, and this is my opinion, only having been an employee there for 5 years, people very, very focused on progression for themselves individually. And it was, as I say, incredibly competitive. Not an environment that I thrived in, to be honest. And I left Amazon without a job in 2017 because I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't continue to have people say to me, we want you to progress. We want you to get involved in this project. And even the word project now, it sends a bit of a chill through me because I know that projects at Amazon involve the public speaking element. And it's obviously been a huge challenge for me. And because I didn't really have the passion, I had a huge amount of imposter syndrome at Amazon. I didn't really feel as though I fitted in there, that I knew what I was talking about, that I had the expertise that other people had. My self-esteem had probably hit an all-time low at that stage. And I decided to leave that organization without a job to go to. And I had a period of, I suppose, reflection at that stage where I really started to think about what it was that I was going to do with the rest of my life, because at that stage I was 34, I was single at the time, and I didn't really know where my life was going. What did the rest of my working life look like, and how was that going to impact my personal life as a whole? Took some time to reflect on that and spent some time volunteering at the Samaritans. So that was something that I really started to take an interest in as I started to understand a bit more about mental health and the impact that it was having. And I was reading more and more about mental health and the impact that it has on people and how we can support people and help each other. And that was hugely impactful on me from my own perspective on my life. One of the unexpected, I suppose, byproducts from volunteering with the Samaritans was speaking with other volunteers. When you're on shift at the Samaritans, you always have another volunteer working next to you, answering calls themselves. And it's important that you take time to talk to each other, to build relationships between yourselves and support each other after what can be difficult calls from time to time, and quite often, as was the case. It was while I was speaking to people that I understood that actually the world of work is hugely impactful to our mental health. And I was aware of this to a certain extent because I'd experienced it, but it was only when people started to talk about actually there were some people doing some work around this and thinking about how we can positively impact people in the workplace around mental health and well-being. And about 6 months later, I'd started a role at a new organization, again working in e-commerce, not feeling particularly fulfilled, but it was a great job and I was paid very well for that role. And this organization had a way of working that resulted in rounds of redundancies on an annual basis towards the end of the year. End of Q3, early Q4, noises around the office would start that, were getting concerned that their roles were at risk. And we had people working in that organization who had been there for their whole working lives and had made friends and support networks in those organizations, and you could see the impact that it had on them. So I started thinking, how does the organization support people through that? And to be brutally honest, there was an incredible lack of resources available at that time. This was 2018, for people to actually reach out and say, do you know what, I'm really struggling with this. I don't know how to process this. I don't know how to deal with this, and try and reduce the impact that it's having on me as an individual, both in and out of work. And I was having conversations with various other Samaritans at the time, and a wonderful lady called Buff Davis, she was my co-volunteer one day, and she started talking to me about a concept called mental health first aid. And she was an instructor for mental health first aid for England, and she used to go into workplaces and train people up in mental health first aid. And I was immediately I just needed to know more about this, because I just felt like this is an extension essentially of the Samaritans' reach into the workplace directly. And I saw almost the exact need that we had at that organisation that was going to be met by Mental Health First Aid for England, or at least it started to be met by that, and the support that could provide. It took about 18 months for me to get buy-in on this. And when I say buy-in, we're talking a couple of £1,000s to train up 16 people in a multi-billion-dollar organisation, a global organisation. So it was tricky, and it taught me a lot how to present a business case to people and get senior leadership buy-in, understanding what you're thinking in terms of a wider strategy around well-being. And there were various other conversations going on around well-being at the time, and I was involved in those from a voluntary perspective at that organisation. And I was really starting to, this is really interesting, and I was spending more and more time thinking about it. And it got me to the point where we'd launched Mental Health First Aid for England in this organisation, and I was kind of like, what's next? What can I do next? And I realised that I was spending probably 80% of my time at work thinking about this stuff. And so the natural progression from there is to think, okay, how do I do this? How do I do this as my day job? So started having conversations around that. Turns out that organisation was nowhere near ready to employ people on a full-time basis to think about that. They had their HR teams, they had their occupational health teams, health and safety, the stuff that they had to have in place. But well-being was far too much of a nice to have for that organisation at the time. And I understand organisations have different levels of maturity in the well-being sense. And fast forward a couple of years, I was made redundant from that organisation, jumped straight into a different organisation, needed to earn a living, same type of role, e-commerce again, was made redundant again. And we're in 2023 now. And I turned around to my wife, having been made redundant that day in February 2023, and I said, I have to do this now. I have to make this happen. And I've simplified it a bit because we're fixed on time here, but essentially over the course of that previous 4 or 5 years, I'd spent a lot of time personally invested in upskilling myself informally, just understanding what this was all about, attending webinars, attending conferences, speaking to people, connecting with people, using LinkedIn again and for the first time in a long time, and understanding what was going on in that environment. It took me 7 months to find a role, and it was an incredibly difficult period of my life, spending that time applying for, I would say, hundreds of jobs over that period, and to take the time to write curated CVs and cover letters that I felt were really good at demonstrating who I was and what I was about. And I was about to give up. I was about to say, do you know what? It's time just to go back and get a different job in the same e-commerce environment and just shelve well-being and mental health in the workplace for a while. And I remember the day very clearly where I read the job spec for Cambridgeshire County Council. I read it and it made total sense to me. It really resonated with me. The goals of a county council and being purely driven by the benefit of their residents and working for their residents, working for people, and doing an employee engagement and wellbeing role. I just thought, this is fantastic. And I called my to-be manager, Anna, that day, because her phone number was strangely on the bottom of the job spec. You don't normally see that on LinkedIn, but that was the start. And I remember coming off that phone call, and I said to my wife, this is it. This is the one. And the rest is history from there, because from that moment on, I've been able to do what I feel passionate about, what I feel I have so much to offer in terms of energy and creativity and all of the things that I was lacking for the best part of 20 years in my career doing other things. And I spent 16 months at the council on a fixed term contract, and then had a great conversation with my boss now, Vicky Staines, here at Computacenter, about becoming the Wellbeing Lead here for the UK organisation. And yeah, I joined in January, and that's long and the short of quite a bit about how I've come about to be landing here where I am today and talking to you, Eileen.
Amazing. It is such a wonderful story. There's obviously a huge amount of heartfelt struggles and challenges, but I think for me, and my face is almost aching a little bit, it's just wonderful. It is absolutely fantastic. Computacenter are incredibly lucky to have someone who is so deeply passionate about this. Thank goodness Anna recognized your passion and potential, and Vicky the same. Like you, but from a very different angle, when I first heard about this idea of mental health first aid, I just thought, that makes absolute sense. We both recognized that moment when something resonates so strongly with you, you have no choice but to follow what that is telling you. And that was very in common for me as well. And we've taken that in slightly different directions. You're in the corporate sector now. I'm out of the corporate sector and leading my own charge of my own business. But it's because it made sense. This is something we have to do it. So I love that passion. And it's obviously come from quite, subconsciously very early on, but it has come from that very early experience. And it's clear that your stammer really has shaped a lot of not just your early experiences, but is still having that impact now in terms of your choices. And I guess looking back, and I know you're clearly a very forward thinker, but you're drawing from your previous experience. So looking back, what kind of support or maybe even just understanding do you think would have made a difference for you? How does that personal experience really relate to the need for inclusion that you perhaps see in today's workplace?
I think you can almost break this down into your early life, your family surroundings, followed by what happens in school, the education environment, and then moving into the workplace and understanding what that looks like for a stammerer, because they're all really important parts of the journey. As somebody who has a stammer and who's tried to fight it for a long time, and it's an important piece of acceptance that I've found, is actually accepting this is part of me, and having people say to me quite often, "You don't have a stammer," and I say to them, "Well, I do. I've just got 35 years experience of hiding it." And hiding is a term that I don't use lightly. I've found ways to cope with it. I think if I look back to my early family life, I think I would have liked some help. I would have liked to explore things like speech therapy at an early stage. Children often suffer with stammers much more severely and those symptoms can subside over time, and I feel I've had that experience. I think for a lot of adults don't have that experience, and seeing people like Gareth Gates and Ed Balls become very prominent on the television talking about stammering is really powerful. But I think at the time when I was young, growing up in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, there wasn't a huge amount of information out there that was available for stammerers. You couldn't just go online and find out what support was available. It just didn't happen. My mum was in the NHS. So I think looking back, it could have been something that we could have looked at together as a family to try and get some more support. I think sometimes when I think about our upbringing, the way that we work as a family, or we worked as a family when we were the four of us when we were growing up, we generally probably didn't talk about things enough, talk about our feelings. And that's something that is really important to understand. If you have a child who has a stammer, it's important to understand how they're feeling. What does tomorrow look like? Are you worried about anything? Is there something that's going on, especially as you go through your teenage years and the changes in hormones and puberty and everything that brings with it? It's a real challenging time, and school can be a brutal place. It really can. I laugh, rather than cry. because I've got a 10-year-old and a 5-year-old child. They're going to have to learn and go through that phase. So I think just having that understanding and being open to conversations where being honest, being vulnerable is a good thing. It's where the growth comes. So I think that from a family life perspective, I really feel like in terms of schools, it's hard for them to find the balance between being aware, first of all, that children, students might have different challenges in their life, understanding that. I think it's important to ask the question, what would make you feel comfortable and able to thrive at school? That as a starting point, as a question, should be, in my opinion, should be asked of every child as they go through probably middle school, into from the ages of sort of 8, 9, 10 onwards, but certainly in secondary school. And teachers should be able to read that feedback, and students should be able to share that feedback without fear of repercussion. I think that's really important, and try and find a way that really guides children in a way that empowers them rather than forces them into situations that could be really damaging for them. And as I say, that balance is really hard, because there were times when I was put in situations where, I actually had a really good conversation with my English teacher when I was 12 years old. My father was actually a teacher at the grammar school that I went to, and I'd said to him, I said, look, I'm really struggling, especially with English, because we were reading books in class. The teacher would ask people to read out loud, and I was just petrified. I was still trying to make friends, didn't want to stand out, be picked on, all of those things. My dad was a teacher at the school. There was just so many red flags for me at the time. And I had a really positive conversation with my English teacher, who was probably an old schooler, if you think about the way that grammar school teachers might have been in the sort of 70s maybe. And he said to me, I can go easy on you for a bit, but at some stage we're going to have to try and do something that really gives you the opportunity to speak. And I was like, yeah, absolutely fine. Kick the can down the road, whatever just needs to happen right now. And that was great. And that supported me for a bit. It was just that whole feeling of anxiety all the way through school, because English was a topic that we pretty much did every day. And as we went through the curriculum through year 8, 9, 10, 11 through to GCSEs, the other subjects, there'd be times when we all had to speak in class. And as I say, that anxiety within me was just something that I thought was just me, and I just had to deal with it. Really tough, but it's important to try and find that right way for individuals to be able to thrive in those environments. And we're so much more open about challenges that people, and especially children, can face in the modern education system. And there's so much more support available, which is great, but we just need to continue that supportive conversation around how they can thrive. And then the same really goes in the workplace, very similar. I've had a limited experience of sharing the fact that I have a stammer with my employers. So I didn't do it until 2021. So I worked in various roles for 17, maybe 18 years without telling anybody that I had a stammer and sharing the impact that it had on me. And it was during lockdown that I had a new manager in the organisation that we'd launched mental health first aid. And I'd started to be more vocal around that. And I found it peculiar, bizarre. Why am I happy to talk about this all of a sudden? And the penny hadn't dropped at that stage. But I said to him, he was my manager from an e-commerce perspective, my day job. And he said, thanks for sharing with it. It's really brave doing so. And I thought, yeah, excellent. We've got someone who understands. And then the following week, he said to me, Matt, I really want you to come and present to our global e-commerce lead and talk about what you've been up to in X, Y, and Z. And I said, okay. And so I did that. And I think he thought he'd fixed me. And it's not a criticism of his approach, because people like to help as best they can. And it's part of the role that I learned at Samaritans and through Mental Health First Aid for England, is that help is not something necessarily that people need. It's understanding, it's compassion, it's empathy. And those kind of elements are far more important in the workplace environment than, trying to take things on yourself and trying to help or trying to advise or trying to fix. And I think that it's really important that we understand the difference between those two approaches, because one is far more appropriate than the other in the workplace, especially these days.
This whole idea that people need to be fixed, it just drives even more isolation to some extent. And I think hiding is a strong word, but I think it's a really, really powerful one and appropriate, especially in school, because I see this all the time. I see it with my children. When things are not okay, they hide. They make themselves as metaphorically as small as they can so they don't get noticed. And that takes a huge amount of energy to do that, of course. Energy that we would absolutely love them to be spending doing something else, ideally in school and in the workplace, contributing. Because, of course, when we haven't felt like we've belonged and we've been accepted for who we are, and as you said, you maybe haven't accepted it yourself, you're pretending to yourself that it's fine, you can hide it, you're pretending to everyone around you, they can't see it, I'm going to mask it. But that must have such a drain on energy, but also that feeling of not really belonging, of not being able to be authentically you. What kind of effect did that have on your confidence as well as your well-being?
I think I mentioned earlier that my self-esteem was incredibly low at times. And confidence, self-esteem, very similar things. I think, as you say, that word hiding is really prevalent in my mind when it comes to thinking back to essentially the last 30 years of my life. I'm 42 today. It's a huge chunk of who I've been in the past. Tucking myself away in situations. It's funny, I remember a time when in those English lessons, I knew when the teacher was going to ask other people to read out loud. If someone else was doing it, come to the end of a paragraph, I'd quickly get my dictionary and pretend to be looking for something in the dictionary to busy myself to try and almost prevent the teacher from asking me to speak next. That's just a coping mechanism that I had and a hiding tool. But that anxiety has been with me all through my childhood and up until the point where I joined the council really and started working in wellbeing. I think one thing that I recognize now is that I have been incredibly brave over the course of my life, and it's really hard for me to credit myself with that. But I've learned a bit more about what courage looks like in recent years. I've been reading a book and I'm looking at it just by the side of my laptop now. It's called Courage and it's by somebody called Osho. And I was told about this book, and this was probably 4 or 5 years ago. I was told about this book, and it would really help me to understand about fear and what courage really looked like, and facing your fears and putting yourselves into those situations regardless of that fear. And there is an element of that, and I've done that throughout my life. Yes, I've dodged a lot of bullets as well, but I have had to do it on a pretty regular basis over the course of those years. And as I say, it's not the absence of fear, but having the courage to face it that really has been a revelation to me. But then, as I say, moving into doing something where I feel I have something to offer and that I don't have anywhere near the amount of imposter syndrome that I had before. Don't get me wrong, I still have it at times, and I certainly felt a little bit about that today, coming in and speaking about myself off my journey. It still takes a bit to be able to get my strength and my bravery up, but I think it really speaks a lot about emotional and psychological roots of courage. It can really inspire on a personal level. And I think that understanding that really went a long way to helping me to regain my confidence. And I remember my wife saying to me a few months ago, this was while I was still working at the council actually, she said, I didn't realize the impact that work was having on you. She didn't really know who I was properly. And she's now seeing it because I'm doing something where I feel confident. My well-being is good, generally speaking. Still have days where I struggle. I'm not going to pretend that I don't. That's okay. But I'm much more aware of that now, and I understand, and I can see the reasons behind it, or identify those causes, and being able to feel confident about going to work every day and looking forward to going to work every day. I remember for years and years I had Monday morning blues. My mum used to have them when she used to go to work. She used to say Sunday nights, she'd be like, oh, I don't want to go to work tomorrow, And as a child, you hear that. And again, this is not a criticism of my upbringing. It's just one of those things that you remember and it sticks with you because it put together with lots of other factors. It creates something in you. And I don't have that anymore. And I just feel so fortunate that I found it, even though it's taken me 20 odd years of working, and I found my passion, I found my interest, I found where I can be creative and use my skills and my knowledge to hopefully impact people positively, not just in the workplace, being a positive influence to my family, to my children and my sister, my parents, as well as we move into the later stages of their life. It makes such a difference, such a difference.
You almost give this sense of being quite liberated, whilst, yes, recognizing there are still challenging days, but there is such a liberation that has clearly happened as a result of you being so brave and also finding those coping mechanisms, getting through, as sad as it sounds to hear you saying that, but still finding ways of managing and getting through it, facing that fear. We don't want people to have to do that. And what we really want is inclusive cultures where people are aware, but understand and accept and make adaptations. You're now in this wonderful position that you can start to do something about this. Do you recommend organizations do to really create a culture where people feel that they can be themselves? They belong, despite the fact that they might be a bit different for whatever reason.
Mm.
What does it actually look like in practice, and what are organizations doing when they're not getting it right?
A lot of the time, this starts with having leaders who are happy to demonstrate vulnerability and to role model positive behaviors in the workplace. And the biggest challenge around this, when you think of senior leaders in most organizations, is that they are senior people as well. So they've been in the workplace for some time. And when they join the workplace, and for probably the majority of that period that they have worked, workplace well-being and openness, compassion, vulnerability have not been things that have been huge factors in them getting to where they are, in a senior position. So why should they care now? So changing the mindset and the thought processes and helping leaders to understand the impact that it can make and that it does make. We know the data behind this. It's very, very common, and it's commonplace now to quote the statistics that are shared regularly. Just having those leaders who are on board, who get it, they talk about it, and then they walk the walk as well. Really important. And then, as a result of that, your middle management, your directors, your sales managers, your team leaders, they can start to see, actually, okay, this is how my leaders act. This is how I want to act. We need to lead with empathy. We need to lead with openness and have a willingness to listen. Really, really important, that listening element. Going into conversations that could become difficult, but being brave enough themselves to start those conversations and not feel as though they need to know the answers, because listening is really important. Understanding what's going on for their teams is a great starting point, because if you can do that, then it builds trust, and it shows that you're leading with compassion and that you are willing to try your best to give them that environment that they want to work in, that they can be most productive. And having those the processes and tools in place to support wellbeing, really, really important. Having the support like the EAPs, the learning and development side of things, helping people to understand why it's important in the workplace, having good peer support networks. This is all part of the rounded piece that needs to exist as well. Because if you've just got really great leaders and good managers, but you've got no tools, then it doesn't work, and vice versa. These things need to go hand in hand. And I think if those things are in place, then people feel as though they're being given permission to be themselves in organizations without fear of what might happen if they do bring their whole selves to work. Because in reality, you want to see people speaking freely about how they've been supported and how it's impacted them, especially within those networks. I think they're really important to share those lived experiences and say, well, actually, I spoke to my manager about this and they were really supportive. And I know that his lead he's been really focused on trying to help with X, Y, or Z in recent months or years. And having that, as I say, walking the walk as well as talking the talk, it's vital, because if you just talk about it and don't do it, it's almost worse than not doing it at all. I think those sort of common mistakes that organizations still make today is that almost thinking that they need to hire people who have similar characteristics to maybe the people down the spine or the core of the business, because I know and we know that things like diversity and inclusion brings such knowledge and a breadth of experience and creativity, and offers so much variety in terms of the skill set that those people bring to organizations. And looking for certain types of people in recruiting can really narrow your pipeline as a starting point and really restrict the talent that you've got access to. But as I say, building those working environments where people can thrive. I always talk about thriving because I think sometimes in my role as a wellbeing lead or as a mental health first aid lead, we think about preventing poor mental health. And there's often a focus on prevention rather than empowering and enabling someone to thrive in their work life, in their personal life. Really positive well-being. What tools can we give people to achieve that? And for me, it's a great measure of success if you have people who are thriving in your organization, not just looking at the data around your EAP utilization or how many contacts you've had from your mental health first aiders. Those types of things, they're really important, don't get me wrong. But we do need to focus on getting people from a good place into a great place. And I think that's something that from a well-being perspective, organizations can often lack a bit of focus on that side of things. It's more at the other end of the spectrum where they're looking at sickness absence. So if we reduce sickness absence, are we driving EAP utilization? All very important, but it has to be a rounded picture.
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it? Because I think it's those objective measures which tend to be measuring the negatives, so sickness, absence, etc. It's those that are so easier to collect and see and measure, and it's the more positive measures that are actually far more difficult to get a handle on. But of course, in any health setting, our aim is to prevent rather than manage what's gone wrong. Of course, we're always going to have people who are struggling and need extra support. But actually, inclusion in particular, for any reason, let's face it, we aren't robots. And to think that you've got but an absolute myriad of different types of people who have different skills, but have different ways of thinking in your organization is not going to be helpful. So we need to adapt the workplace to support those people to thrive. So I love that kind of, by the sounds of it, looking forward for you, it is about how do we move more onto the promotion of good well-being and mental health and the prevention of decline rather than necessarily just mopping what's broken. At the end of our conversation, I'm going to do what I do with all of my guests. I'm going to give you a magic wand. And you can do anything you like with this magic wand. You can use it at an organization level, team level, even focusing on individuals. But what would you do in the whole space of workplace well-being? What would you do with your magic wand?
Well, that's a great question. I think that compassion is hugely underrated in life. And I think if I could instill compassion into every single one of us, both in the way we work and how we act as people, I think there's so much that it can do. I think it can give us connection. If we approach other people and situations with compassion, then we can listen more actively, be less judgmental, respond more kindly. I just think that can only be a good thing. And it gives us those sort of stronger connections at work and at home as well. I think compassion can create that psychologically safe space that we really seek everywhere that we are. I think it allows people, empowers them to be honest about what they're experiencing without fear of stigma or judgment, which, let's be honest, it's a huge impact in the way that we are as human beings, for sure. I think it, as you say, it supports inclusion. It means that people feel valued. They understand that others will see and value the different human being that they are. It just gives us the power to move from a place where we're maybe assuming things about people. We move to a place where we're understanding them more. That's a hugely powerful thing. I've obviously spoken about compassionate leadership, and that's something that I learned a lot about at the council. They had a compassionate leadership training program for all of their leaders, and that was hugely impactful. It's not a soft skill. This is a strategic skill. Let's be honest. I hate the fact that we call these things soft skills. It builds trust, it builds loyalty, and as I say, that psychological safety in your organization. And we know those teams outperform others who don't have that as well. So why are we not doing it?
I couldn't agree more. What a wonderful way to use your magic wand. And I think I should let you go and enjoy your birthday celebrations. But with your children and your wife, they've been very kind in letting us have you on your birthday. And absolutely brilliant job on your first podcast. You should definitely do more of them. You have a wonderful story to tell. So I can't thank you enough. It's been brilliant. Thank you, Matt.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Eileen. It's been an absolute pleasure. And we'd love to come back and talk again one day.
What a really impressive conversation, and wonderful to hear Matt's story. So thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please like, rate, or subscribe. It really helps spread the word about the Work and Wellbeing podcast. You can also connect with me at Eileen@Ripple&Co.com. We're on a mission to create environments where you can thrive in both work and wellbeing.